3. Material achievement. Save for occasional minor local conflicts easily quelled by the world police, the race was now a single social unit for some 4,000 years. During the first of these millennia, material progress at least was rapid, but subsequently there was little change until the final disintegration. The whole energy of man was concentrated on maintaining at a constant pitch the furious routine of his civilization until, after another 3,000 years of lavish expenditure, certain essential sources of power were suddenly exhausted. Nowhere was there the mental agility to cope with this novel crisis. The whole social order collapsed. We may pass over the earlier stages of this fantastic civilization and examine it as it stood just before the fatal change began to be felt. The material circumstances of the race at this time would have amazed all its predecessors, even those who were, in the true sense, far more civilized beings. But to us, the last men, there is an extreme pathos and even comicality, not only in this most thorough confusion of material development with civilization, but also in the actual paucity of the vaunted material development itself compared with that of our own society. All the continents, indeed, were by now minutely artificialized. Save for the many wild reserves which were cherished as museums and playgrounds, not a square mile of territory was left in a natural state, nor was there any longer a distinction between agricultural and industrial areas. All the continents were urbanized, not of course in the manner of the congested industrial cities of an earlier age, but nonetheless urbanized. Industry and agriculture interpenetrated everywhere. This was possible partly through the great development of aerial communication, partly through a no less remarkable improvement of architecture. Great advances in artificial materials had enabled the erection of buildings in the form of slender pylons which, rising often to a height of 3 miles or even more, and found at a quarter of a mile beneath the ground, might yet occupy a ground plan of less than half a mile across. In section, these structures were often cruciform, and on each floor the centre of the long-armed cross consisted of an aerial landing, providing direct access from the air for the dwarf private aeroplanes which were by now essential to the life of every adult. These gigantic pillars of architecture, prophetic of the still mightier structures of an age to come, were scattered over every continent in varying density. Very rarely were they permitted to approach one another by a distance less than their height. On the other hand, save in the Arctic, they were very seldom separated by more than 20 miles. The general appearance of every country was thus rather like an open forest of lopped tree trunks, gigantic in stature. Clouds often encircled the middle heights of these artificial peaks, or blotted out all but the lower stories. Dwellers in the summits were familiar with the spectacle of a dazzling ocean of cloud, dotted on all sides with steep islands of architecture. Such was the altitude of the upper floors that it was sometimes necessary to maintain in them not merely artificial heating, but artificial air pressure and oxygen supply. Between these columns of habitation and industry, the land was everywhere green or brown, with the seasonal variations of agriculture, park and wild reserve. Broad grey thoroughfares for heavy freight traffic netted every continent, but lighter transport and the passenger services were wholly aerial. Over all the more populous districts the air was ever aswarm with planes up to a height of 5 miles, where the giant airliners plied between the continents. The enterprise of an already distant past had brought every land under civilization. The Sahara was a lake district, crowded with sun-proud holiday resorts. The Arctic islands of Canada, ingeniously warmed by directed tropical currents, were the homes of vigorous northerners. The coasts of Antarctica, thought in the same manner, were permanently inhabited by those engaged in exploiting the mineral wealth of the hinterland. Much of the power needed to keep this civilization in being was drawn from the buried remains of prehistoric vegetation in the form of coal. Although after the foundation of the world state the fuel of Antarctica had been very carefully husbanded, the new supply of oil had given out in less than 3 centuries, and men were forced to drive their aeroplanes by electricity generated from coal. It soon became evident, however, that even the unexpectedly rich coal fields of Antarctica would not last forever. The cessation of oil had taught men a much-needed lesson, had made them feel the reality of the power problem. At the same time, the cosmopolitan spirit, which was learning to regard the whole race as compatriots, was also beginning to take a broader view temporally, and to see things with the eyes of remote generations. During the first and sanest 1,000 years of the world state, there was a widespread determination not to incur the blame of the future by wasting power. Thus, not only was there serious economy, the first large-scale cosmopolitan enterprise, but also efforts were made to utilise more permanent sources of power. Wind was used extensively. On every building, swarms of windmills generated electricity, and every mountain range was similarly decorated, while every considerable fall of water forced its way through turbines. More important still was the utilisation of power derived from volcanoes and from borings into the subterranean heat. This, it had been hoped, would solve the whole problem of power once and for all. But even in the earlier and more intelligent period of the world state, inventive genius was not what it had been, and no really satisfactory method was found. Consequently, at no stage of this civilization did volcanic sources do more than supplement the amazingly rich coal seams of Antarctica. In this region, coal was preserved at far greater depths than elsewhere, because, by some accident, the Earth's central heat was not here fierce enough, as it was elsewhere, to turn the deeper beds into graphite. Another possible source of power was known to exist in the ocean tides, but the use of this was forbidden by the SOS because, since tidal motion was so obviously astronomical in origin, it had come to be regarded as sacred. Perhaps the greatest physical achievement of the First World State in its earlier and more vital phase had been in preventative medicine. Though the biological sciences had long ago become stereotyped in respect of fundamental theories, they continued to produce many practical benefits. No longer did men and women have to dread for themselves or those dear to them such afflictions as cancer, tuberculosis, angina pectoris, the rheumatic diseases, and the terrible disorders of the nervous system. No longer were there sudden microbic devastations. No longer was childbirth an ordeal and womanhood itself a source of suffering. There were no more chronic invalids, no more lifelong cripples. Only senility remained, and even this could be repeatedly alleviated by physiological rejuvenation. The removal of all these ancient sources of weakness and misery, which formerly had lamed the race and haunted so many individuals either with definite terrors or vague and scarcely conscious despond, brought about now a pervading buoyancy and optimism impossible to earlier peoples.